Interesting lakes and rivers drive a lot of really rich, luscious world building in fantasy novels. When we hear that the River Ankh is so polluted that you can walk across its surface, and that the mudlarks make a living finding valuable items washed downstream, that paints a picture of what everyday life is like in Ankh-Morpork. Ditto the fens and canals of the alternate England in the His Dark Materials series. Pullman's construction of fantasy versions of itinerant cultures leaves something to be desired, but the canal boat scenes in the first book of the trilogy gives us a glimpse into the politics and culture of this alternate England and fleshes out the world beyond its narrow aristocratic origins. And the periodic floods in Gujarat inform the structure of the city and its economy and its timekeeping in the Killing Moon, but they also set up the concept of a history punctuated by cycles of devastation and rebuilding. These aren't necessarily the first features of a world that anyone wants to build, but they do end up backing a lot of the details that make a fantasy world feel grounded and lived in and also symbolically rich. As an example of when this falls apart, try reading any of the Dresden Files books, and while you're reading, try to build a mental model of Lake Michigan that matches Jim Butcher's. The importance of lakes and rivers and bodies of water in building an interesting and evocative setting is probably also on my mind because I live in a metro area that looks like this. We have canals, ferries, drawbridges, houseboats, a train line that runs across a lake on a floating bridge. The rough terrain and the really complicated coastlines are a huge part of why the city looks and operates the way it does. And so it's hard not to imagine fantasy worlds with similar inconvenient bodies of water. The first time I witnessed one of these drawbridges opening while I was out on a bike ride, I was fascinated. And then, inspired by this, I inflicted half a session's worth of drawbridge puzzles on my D&D players. The puzzles were probably a mistake, but building in this kind of realistic geography and giving my players the chance to think about what it means to actually physically travel in-game made the world feel richer and more lived in, which is always the goal. So far in our project, we have terrain and climate variables like summer temperature, winter temperature, and total precipitation. How do we go from here to adding lakes and rivers? As always, we're not going for hyper-realism here. We're trying to build something that looks reasonable and gives us a map of a larger-than-life world where we could potentially build interesting stories. But also, people tend to have very strong intuition for how rivers and lakes are supposed to look. So we probably want to mostly accord with that intuition. Lakes and rivers are also going to be important for the next steps of the project, where we'll be adding things like biomes and settlements. With all that said, welcome to another episode of Multiversal Map Room, where we make fantasy map generation software for world building, writing, and TTRPGs 1 week at a time. This week, we're making the map moister by adding lakes and rivers. So here's a terrain map, generated with the newest version of the terrain generation code. I've tweaked this a bit since the last video. Let's think about how we would add some lakes and rivers. As a reminder, we can assign climate variables to all the land masses here, based on the statistical modeling we did last week. We know how hot the weather gets in the summer, how cold in the winter, how much rainfall everywhere gets. This map here has a relatively mild climate, with latitudes ranging from temperate to subtropical. All the low-lying land close to the ocean really gives more of a moderate environment. And from here, the process for building lakes is going to look a lot like the process for building oceans. First, we're going to identify some low points in the terrain where water could conceivably start to pool. I've marked these points here with big pink stars. Then, starting from these low points, we are going to grow lakes outward, pixel by pixel, as long as the net water contribution from the land covered by the lake continues to support the larger and larger volume of the lake. Throughout, we're defining net water contribution as the difference between the precipitation rate and the evaporation rate. That last part might seem a bit confusing. Here's how it works. In the top panel, you're looking at a very simplified 2D version of a lake. The lake is deeper in the middle and shallower around the edges. The total lake volume here is 12 pixels. And in the bottom panel, you're looking at the difference between precipitation and evaporation levels at each point across the lake. That is the net water contribution. This is the net amount of water that each of those horizontal axis pixels can contribute to the lake. As you see here, the land around the lake varies in its net water contribution. It's particularly dry to the left of the lake. However, overall, the land covered by the lake contributes 15 pixels worth of water, which is more than the lake's volume of 12. So, how do things look as the size of the lake increases? If we increase the water level, the total lake volume increases for two reasons. First, we cover more pixels with water, so effectively the surface area of the lake increases. But secondly, the lake gets deeper, so there's more water underneath the existing pixels. In our little example here, the volume of the lake has gone from 12 pixels to 19 pixels. Meanwhile, with this slightly larger lake, we're getting slightly more water from the newly covered pixels. The net difference between precipitation and evaporation, that net water contribution, is an additional 7 pixels of water, which covers the increase in volume. So we've increased the water level, and there's still more net water contribution than there is total volume covered, so the lake is still stable. However, if we increase the water level again, this doesn't work anymore. Now, the lake has a volume of 28 pixels, but the total net water contribution from the area covered by the lake is only 25 pixels. So we've ended up in a situation where the increase in volume is larger than the increase in net water contribution, because this time the larger lake would be covering drier terrain. This gives us a maximum water level for the lake, at which the surface area added by the larger lake no longer compensates for the total volume. That's pretty much what we're going to be doing here on the maps we've generated. We model the precipitation level directly in the climate variables. We can use temperatures to infer what evaporation looks like, and that gives us net water contribution. I'm glossing over some details, like how we merge lakes if they start to touch as we grow them outward, but overall what we're doing is just very gradually increasing the water level and seeing if the net difference between precipitation and evaporation gives us enough new water to compensate for the larger lake volume. And here's how that ends up looking. As you might expect, parts of the map that are rainier and flatter tend to have more and larger lakes. In particular, we see 5 or 6 sizable lakes on that southwestern continent. Conversely, dry parts of the map, and especially hot and dry parts of the map, are way less likely to generate big lakes. We also see relatively few large lakes at very high altitudes, which is the sort of realistic looking outcome we'd hope for. If you look closely, you'll also notice that the setup gives us islands within lakes in some cases, although on this map they're only a couple pixels in size. Here's a totally different terrain map. We've set the altitude and latitude variables here to give us a warmer, wetter world with fewer steep elevations. When we run the same lake generation here, what does that give us? Unsurprisingly, the warmer, wetter world with more large, flat areas gives us way more lake coverage. We end up with a particularly long chain of lakes along the lowlands in the east of the map. This area could be wetlands or maybe flooded fields like paddies. You can also see some large islands in a couple of these lakes. And finally, here's a third map where we've set the whole world to be much cooler and a little drier and filled with one big continent. How do the lakes look now? We actually do get quite a few lakes here in that southwestern area that's a little flatter and wetter than much of the map. Meanwhile, in the east, we get no lakes whatsoever. The land there is rocky and dry and probably inhospitable. The southwest might be the most densely populated area, with all the farms and towns and kingdoms, and maybe the east is a cold, dry wilderness. So I think this works pretty decently in terms of giving us varied and plausible lake distributions over the land masses on the map. What about rivers? A fully realistic simulation of geology and erosion and all the related processes would let rivers form and carve their way through the terrain. But as always, that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to build interesting maps that can serve as scaffolding for fantasy world building. And so for rivers, we're going to be doing something a little simpler. Specifically, to build rivers, we're going to be doing some very light graph theory. First off, we can think of the terrain map as a collection of pixels where each pixel has an elevation. Water pixels have elevations, but they're underwater, so let's just assert that every single one of those has the same sea level elevation of 0. When we think about rivers, we tend to imagine they start at high altitudes and flow downhill to lower altitudes. So for each pixel, let's draw an arrow towards the neighboring pixel with the lowest elevation among all the neighbors. If a pixel is lower than all of its neighbors, we won't draw any arrows at all. So here's how those arrows look. And if we want our rivers to look plausible, they need to run along those arrows, right? When we think river, we think water that's flowing downhill over the terrain. And we can start connecting chains of those arrows that cumulatively point from a high elevation pixel to a lower elevation pixel to a lower elevation pixel, and so on, all the way to the ocean or to a local depression. Let's see what that looks like. We can clear out the numbers too, just to make everything easier to look at. And here's how those chains end up looking. Some of them just flow straight into the ocean from coastal pixels. Some flow into local depressions, and some are longer branching paths. All of this has some very promising river-like attributes. No loops, always flowing downhill, not branching off into multiple paths from the same point. For clarity, let's highlight some of the longest ones, because long chains might be the most narratively interesting rivers. Do these seem like reasonable candidate rivers? At the very least, they're flowing across the map from high elevation to low elevation pixels, mostly to the ocean, but some to a low elevation interior pixel. And let's also say that we can use local precipitation information to knock one out of contention, because it only travels through extremely dry land. So now we've built rivers that rely only on elevation and precipitation. They have halfway reasonable topography for rivers, and they all flow down into oceans or lakes, and they don't hydrate deserts for no reason. So let's apply the same logic to the terrain and climate maps we've been generating and see how that looks. And for the first map from the start of the video, here's how it looks. We get a pretty satisfying range of rivers. A couple flow into lakes, but most flow into oceans. One has a nice branching structure. This map is maybe not the best for showcasing rivers because the land masses are kind of skinny relative to the overall map, and therefore there's not enough room for very long rivers. And here's how it looks for that warmer, wetter map. Unsurprisingly, a lot more rivers here, especially around that chain of lakes in the east. One thing we can't quite do yet is build rivers that connect one lake to the next. That's maybe something to revisit in the future. And finally, here's how it looks for the much drier map with one big continent. Some rivers in the west, but again, nothing in that big arid wasteland in the east. The land masses are bigger on this map, and so we have room for longer rivers, and we also get some interesting branching pairs of rivers. I think this gives us enough to go off of in terms of lakes and rivers. Over the next few weeks, we can use these to start thinking about biomes and economies and settlements, and finally start edging into the stuff that most of us think of as cool fantasy world building. But for now, that's all for this week. As always, I'm grateful for feedback and suggestions, so don't hesitate to leave a reply. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.